2020, Claire Thorpe and I published findings from a research study that sought to gain us a better understanding of what evidence-based practice looked like in library and information service organisations. The resulting maturity model shows how library leaders can determine whether their organisation is practicing in an evidence-based way. This sit-down video shows a glimpse into how this research came about, what the research process looked like alongside our day-to-day work, and what the findings do and don't tell us about evidence-based library and information service organisations. So back when I was in the newly created role of Coordinator for Evidence-Based Practice at the University of Southern Queensland Library, one afternoon I walked into Claire's office, my supervisor at that time, with a question. I knew that my role existed to facilitate, enable, and coach evidence-based practice across library teams. I talked to library teams about the evidence that they needed in order to demonstrate their value and impact. But what about my role? What measures or indicators are or should be in place about whether my role was being effective? What are the strategies that have been proven to work in advancing evidence-based practice capabilities? When should they be implemented? And how do we even measure evidence-based practice capability and maturity, not only from an individual perspective, but at this organisational level? Good questions? Yeah, we thought so too. Claire comes back to me a few days later with a solution, a capability maturity model, a model not for the individual practitioner, but for how library and information service organisations can measure their maturity in evidence-based practice capability. Much as what was known about EBLIP at that time was from the individual perspective. I published a commentary in 2018 in the EBLIP journal proposing that we move this conversation forward with an organisational lens. It was well received. I proposed that we needed to consider ways to how whole library and information service organisations could be evidence-based. Even insight from the literature outside the library profession was limited. Empirical research was needed. Years before my commentary, Kofuji and Narkis had found that organisational dynamics and culture played a massive role in how individual practitioners gathered, used, and applied evidence for decision making. Claire's and I study on EBLIP maturity was a step forward in addressing this gap in the research evidence base and in our professional knowledge. The setting was academic libraries. Like any good research question, we needed to have a well-defined question and scope in order to have a clear design and method to validate and have reliable findings. The scope also reduced complexity, adding strength to the study's findings. We had to build the theory from the ground up. A survey or a questionnaire would have been a bit useless, given that the limited research evidence didn't give us much insight into the nuances and individual differences of evidence-based practice experience as an organisation. So semi-structured interviews were the data collection method for this study. Ethics approval was provided by the university. I had drafted 1 or 2 ethics applications in my time, and I drafted up this one. There were interview protocols and consent forms that needed to be developed and completed by the participants. We employed a convenient sampling technique, utilising Claire's and I's networks in order to recruit participants. Over a few months, I conducted 16 interviews with LIS professionals across Australia and New Zealand at various levels. As this research was part of my work and my supervisor was my co-author, interviews were conducted in work time. Participants were asked to reflect upon their evidence-based practice experiences, the level of maturity that is demonstrated by their library, and to describe what they thought what an evidence-based library looked like. Interview recordings were transcribed and then analysed using the Braun and Clark's method for thematic analysis. I had analysed the bulk of the data before Claire and I pieced together what the data was telling us into the capability maturity model. The result was a maturity model among 5 levels with different dimensions that indicated maturity. These dimensions were themes arising out of the data. I was about to go on parental leave with my first son at the time, so I had to hand over the reins to Claire for the write-up and the presentation and publication of findings. What this study told us was that a capability maturity model was a valid way of measuring EBLIP in organisations, or at least academic libraries. Not only showed the extent to which a library could be evidence-based, but also the dimensions on which it could demonstrate its maturity. What the findings don't tell us is whether there are equal space between all the tiers, or can parts of a library demonstrate higher maturity along some dimensions compared to others. What it also doesn't tell us is whether one or another dimension could be progressed in maturity faster than another. The capability maturity model and its dimensions are yet to be fully tested. The findings, along with the model, were published in 2019 and 2020. What was interesting about this practitioner research experience, this collaboration between Claire and myself, that it could have been a PhD done by either one of us. But there were two things that were holding us back, at least from my perspective. One was that a PhD takes years to complete, and the profession needed this model yesterday. And two, well, two heads are better than one, right? We both had strengths in this area that we could bring together in order to make this model in this study more robust, more reliable, and valid. Bringing both our experience and our brains together on this project, I think ultimately created better outcomes than if one of us had done this solo. Hopefully this video shed some light on this research project, as well as what the experience was like as an evidence-based practitioner. Until next time, cheers.